You're very close to a cold drop there, Lloyd. I'd be careful if I were you. Welcome to the Texas Department of Agriculture and Public Education, the podcast that makes time and space for pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, agrarian concerns, horticulture, and other totally related departments. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again, everyone.
Neil Almond.
Lovely to be here.
And Lloyd Williams-Jones.
Hello there.
Now, we're going to kick off this week's show with a new segment I like to call I'm Not Crying, It's Just Been Raining on My Face. A short salute to our listeners where we can share some of the lovely things members of the TDaPE family have had to say about the podcast. And so this one comes from one of our listeners, Tom, and he says, what an amazing episode. This is off the back of the 100th episode. And can I just say that my pedagogy has changed an incredible amount, brackets, and in a good way, and that's honestly mostly down to TDaPE. It's given me fresh ideas, new friendships, and a real sense of what teaching should be and needs to be in 2022. Thank you so much for keeping me challenged and curious about how we can be better. And if you want to help spread the word about the podcast, or just share some of the ways listening has helped you, please do leave a review wherever you listen. Now, the focus of this week's episode is going to be support for HLTAs. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
Well, it's going to be a bit of a lengthy discussion, so apologies in advance. But I was asked on Twitter recently what FORI was, F-O-R-I. And I knew it was somewhere in the back of my mind. I knew I'd read about it. So I spent the last week kind of diving back into this stuff and was pleased to find that it was something to do with reading. It's fluency orientated reading instruction. And I learned this again from looking at a paper called Whole Class or Small Group Fluency Instruction, a tutorial of 4 effective approaches by Kuhn 2020. It is a really interesting paper. But I'm not going to talk much about that paper, apart from to say that from it, I was reminded that this fluency-orientated reading instruction is a way of introducing pupils to fluency or teaching them fluency in a way that kind of gradually releases responsibility across a week. You start with a text on a Monday, you read it to them, you discuss it. On Tuesday, you do an echo read with the kind of back and forth reading, sentence by sentence or couple of sentences by couple of sentences. Then you do a choral read. And then on the Thursday, they do a partner read. So they really actively do some decoding. And then on Friday, they answer some questions, do a bit of writing. But it's the same text across a week. So I was really interested to learn about this. And then I couldn't help from noticing in this paper that there was something else called wide FORI, which I thought, yeah, I vaguely remember this as well. And wide FORI came up when someone said, well, hang on a minute, are kids getting enough experience with different kinds of texts when they do this FORI reading? And the answer is probably no. So someone did a version of FORI where they do the first 3 days, the reading aloud, the echo reading and the choral reading, and then they do an echo read with 2 different texts. Now, the interesting thing about this, to me at least, is that this seems to have all the benefits of the other kind of fluency instruction, this FORI, without actually asking pupils to do this active decoding themselves, which if you just read that, is probably a little scary because you think, hang on a minute, pupils can develop their fluency without actively decoding. Maybe I've been wasting my time all these years getting pupils to actively do the decoding that they need to do. And it's only when you go back into like the lineage of where this comes from, back to where it was originally came from, that you learn that this FORI and wide FORI was aimed at kind of 7 and 8 year olds, so pupils who are potentially already pretty good at decoding, and B, it was alongside decoding practice as part of literacy instruction. Now, the only reason I bring this all up is because it reminded me of how important it is not to jump to conclusions from the first time you read a paper, because it would be dead easy to learn about something like FORI or wide FORI and then say, well, kids don't need to do any active decoding. I just can do echo reading and choral reading with them, and that will sort their fluency, that will sort their decoding. I can teach reading like that. In short, it was a nice little reminder, as I say, of how important it is to track the lineage of a paper. So, yeah, thanks for letting me expound on that a little bit. Neil, what are you reading for?
So I got two. One is... they're both obviously quite serious, but one's more serious than the other. So I'll go for the least serious one, and that is, as Chris will know, interested a lot in morphology and how we can think about morphology instruction in schools and how that can tie in with a bit of vocabulary and a bit of spelling. So I was doing my late night Google searching and came across a paper called Morphological Structures in Jason Mraz's Songs, which, you know, is quite a niche part of research, which I, wasn't expecting to find. So if anyone's interested in this particular song, 87.8 of the words that contained a morpheme were free morphemes. Inflectional morphemes made up 8.5%, and derivational morphemes made up 3.7%. The more serious bit of research was optimizing the efficacy of learning objectives through pre-tests. Pre-tests is something that I've started to have a little bit of obsession with, just because I find it quite interesting that you can test pupils on some knowledge that they don't know yet, that you're about to teach them. And if you give them this pre-test, then research seems to suggest that actually they'll learn better than those who didn't get tested on the information that they're about to teach. And what I really liked about this particular paper was that it talks about learning objectives, which we talked about on the podcast before, but they've kind of always had a bit of a funny relationship with teachers as something that, every lesson has to have a lesson objective, and really is there much of a point, where this one seems to suggest that if you provide a lesson objective and a short quiz on what that lesson objective is and don't give any feedback on that quiz, then kids learn better than those who were just presented with the learning objective but no quiz, and those that were presented with a learning objective, did a quiz but did get feedback on that quiz. So yeah, I'm not going to say that I now, this is going to be a massive change of pedagogy in my in the schools that I kind of work with and support, but just found it particularly interesting. Lloyd, what are you reading for?
So I have been diving into the riveting world of schools' financial benchmarking tools from the DFE. Quite an interesting little website, that, actually, and quite an interesting little tool for those of you who haven't come across it. You can compare any schools and any trusts on a benchmarking tool across the country and see all of their spend. You can look at the costs that they spend on staffing, on resourcing. You can literally pick any schools you want, a similar profile, and look at all the breakdowns of how their finances are spent in schools. It's a very, very interesting tool just to look at different schools and look at how people spend their money. Not obviously the majority of costs goes to staff wages. That's the bulk, like over 80% of the costs of a school go to staff wages, and the rest is quite. I didn't quite appreciate that it was that much. Quite interesting to see what schools' total budgets are as well. It's part of my NPQH with ambition. I'm into sort of the financial and sort of recruitment and retention section of the course, and it's the sort of stuff I'll be honest, I really have very little knowledge about. And I'm having to really concentrate and reread and go back and sort of look over things and look over the best models for how to manage schools and financial sort of services in schools and things. But yeah, that's a really interesting little tool, the financial benchmarking tool, and it's just available to anybody who should wish to look at it. Not that I think many people outside of teaching would, not that I think many people in teaching would, to be quite honest with you, but it was quite interesting. I can see Neil sort of has piqued his interest a little bit. I feel like he's going to be straight on there tonight now, and he's you lose hours of sleep comparing schools and trusts across the country. It's been quite an eye-opener for me, that. So it's not particularly research engaged, my reading this week, but I think, when looking towards, training to be a head teacher, you really do need to have an awareness of this stuff and just how sort of the best approaches to dealing with budgets and to deal with like what's quite a complex job actually for a head, like to manage this stuff and to make sure this stuff goes correctly. And nobody comes into teaching really to be a financial manager. Yet when the further up you go, the kind of more onus is put on you to deal with budgets and to manage money and it's quite it's quite a lot of responsibility. So quite frankly, it terrifies me, but it's that's something I'm going to continue to read about and further my knowledge about. So, Kieran, what you reading for?
Yeah, so recently I've been listening to one of the great courses on Audible. You'd think I'd be sponsored by them the amount of times I recommend these, but it's a really good hinterland. It was Italians before Italy, conflict and competition in the Mediterranean, and it looks at the large city-states across, I want to say 1300s was sort of really the high point of activity, and up towards when Italian unification became a thing. And so if you're looking for hinterland around any of your sort of history curricula, you can't, there are very few areas with such interesting and dense histories than that part of the Mediterranean, and a lot of the stuff, although we won't directly teach it, will have a direct impact on things that you're learning about at some point across school. So well worth checking out. And like I said, they're free, a lot of them on Audible. And so you're getting your audiobook a month and you are getting, access to some of the greatest courses you can ever think. And if you're from Audible and you're listening, then you feel free to sponsor this podcast because I'm more than happy. It's like that Alistair Campbell thing. Oh, do you use WhatsApp? I also use WhatsApp. Now, this week we have a request from either Ko-fi or Discord, and it's around support we can provide for HLTAs. And I think it makes sense, as always, to start, Neil, with what do we mean by HLTA?
So HLTA obviously stands for a higher level teaching assistant. I don't want to think of it in terms of hierarchies, but if you wanted to, it sits kind of above a teaching assistant because they're higher level, but they kind of come underneath the idea of a teacher, but we'll kind of get to that kind of perhaps false dichotomy of what actually happens. Effectively, as far as I'm aware, the legal differences is that HLTAs are allowed to look after a class by themselves, and as part of that job spec, you can say that a bit of teaching is totally appropriate, whereas with TAs, it's not unheard of that they get asked to cover classes, but really not that they shouldn't be asked, but they could turn around and say, no, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And as a leader, you'd have to say, fair enough. HLTA, they can be directed to do that, and they get a tiny bit about more money for the pleasure. In terms of my kind of experiences, not much actually. In my current school, we kind of only have one HLTA who is kind of only used for those kind of cover aspects, in dire emergencies, which I know was going to be an interesting contrast to Lloyd, because Lloyd's whole kind of school improvement model relies on pretty much the whole workforce being the whole teaching assistant workforce being HLTAs.
Why come in here? I guess, yeah, Neil's sort of nailed it there in terms of the sort of remit of the role. I think they were introduced in 2003 as part of the workforce reforms in schools, and they also have a set of standards, the HLTA standards. So like teachers have teaching standards, HLTAs also have standards. So I think it's probably important to put that out there, that there is a set of standards that they need to sort of adhere to in order to meet the qualifications and the criteria of the role, sort of thing. So that would be the only bit that I add. But like Neil said, it's an interesting one, HLTAs. I think we'll probably get into it in a bit. But there's such a vast array of the ways that HLTAs are viewed in primary schools across the country, it's quite. I think it makes for quite an interesting discussion tonight, because, like, in some schools they are deemed as like next to teachers, and then in other schools it's just not the case, and everything in between. So I think, you know, some to our listeners, like, there'll be something in here that you can relate to, that somebody explains, I should imagine, as we go along. But yeah, I think, like I say, that probably encompasses the role and what it means to be a HLTA.
I think an interesting contrast here as well. Again, speaking just from the experience of one or two secondary schools, is how rarely or how different the role is, seemingly, in terms of what an HLTA does at a primary school and a secondary school. So my partner, she works with a few HLTAs in different classes that she works with, and the idea that they would be frequently asked to cover whole classes, to potentially plan, to assess, that they might have a bit of PPA in order to undertake those particular responsibilities is just much less common, at least in her school, but also with a few other secondary teachers I've spoken to. Though not unheard of course, that they will cover. It's just at secondary schools, it tends to be the role of a particular, like a cover supervisor or something along those lines. I think the reality at primary school is that there's been a sense of mission creep. I think that COVID has kind of contributed to that as well, and over time we've gone from a situation where HLTAs generally were asked to occasionally cover while taking kind of groups and bits and pieces here or there, to the point where I don't think it's that uncommon for an HLTA to be asked to fill in the rest of a term when a teacher leaves at short notice, or for an HLTA to spend almost the entirety, if not the entirety, of their week teaching whole classes as part of their timetable. I mean, I think a couple of things to note in there is that there are qualifications that an HLTA can take. I believe they're kind of level 4 qualifications, but it's not necessary. You don't have to have that qualification in order to fulfill the role. I had a little look online earlier, and according to the NEU, about 3/4 of support staff who undertake this kind of the responsibilities that you might usually associate with a supply teacher don't feel like there is any difference between what they do and what a supply teacher does, even though, of course, one is a qualified teacher and one doesn't have such a qualification. I think the key thing here is that if you look into the original statement of what an HLTA's responsibilities are supposed to entail, you find that a key phrase in there is the idea is that when it comes to whole classes, it should be short term for whole classes. So as soon as HLTAs are doing something with whole classes over or long term, be it for a half term or a term covering for a teacher, then they are being asked on some level to go beyond their stated remit. It's worth noting as well that where HLTAs are asked to do this in a lot of circumstances, it'd be very easy to kind of start blaming schools and school leaders. But with budgets the way they are and the way things have progressed over the last decade or so, there are holes and there are gaps in our education system that have been admirably patched up by these people undertaking these roles. And the reality is we kind of recognize that in many schools, HLTAs are de facto cover teachers, in effect.
I hope, Chris, what we kind of talked about kind of chimes with your experience. I know you've talked on the past on the podcast how before you became a teacher, you were a HLTA. So what is it like to be one?
Yeah, so actually, I took a slightly odd route. I was qualified teacher for a couple of years, and then on what I thought was my way out of teaching, I was then an HLTA for a year and a bit at a local school. What was it like? The first thing to know is that I think the hardest teaching I've ever done, the most challenging teaching I've ever done, was when I was an HLTA. Even though I was a qualified teacher and I've been teaching for a couple of years, the nature of being an HLTA is often that you pick up classes at short notice. You are dealing with lots of different teachers' ways of planning things. It's much more difficult to teach from someone else's planning, but especially if under certain circumstances you are picking up that planning with 10 minutes to spare. it's also the case that compared to, say, supply teaching, you are sometimes not viewed by the pupils in the same way as a teacher is viewed, because as part of your role as an HLTA, you will often be working in the classroom alongside a teacher who's taking charge. And so then when you take charge of that class, the pupils are kind of looking at you as if to say, okay, but when's the real teacher coming back? And I think that makes life much more difficult for HLTAs under a lot of circumstances. In short, I think it's a really, really difficult job in that it has all the challenges of supply without this sense that you're, a inverted commas proper teacher. One of the other things that, I remember from it clearly is how quickly I learned stuff. I feel like the time I spent as an HLTA kind of bouncing across different classes taught me, I think I learned more in that year than I did in the 2 years prior to that, when I had my own single class. I got to see lots of teachers planning. I got to see lots of different pupils, lots of different age ranges. So there are advantages to it. It just happens to be a bit of a baptism of fire. But I'd say those are the key things that I took away from it. I think it's particularly challenging if you are being expected to teach a full timetable. The one thing or almost a full timetable, one of the things I would say that makes it particularly difficult is often you are expected to teach to the standard of a teacher with all of this short-term things that short-term difficulties that I've mentioned there, but often also you're not necessarily paid to attend staff meetings where professional development's going on. So little routines, how the registers are going to work, which you've been introduced to at a staff meeting, how you're going to teach a certain thing, certain language you're going to use, how you're going to deal with multiplication tables, or whatever it might be. Often you're picking that up on the fly. And I guess the very last thing to note is often, because you're filling in at short notice, quite often you're covering a class where that teacher would usually have you or someone else to support. And so not only are you covering that class, you are covering it relatively short-handed compared to the usual class teacher. So yeah, the short answer is it's really, really tough to be an HLTA, I'd say.
Can I just ask, Chris, were you then expected to do like a break duty, lunchtime duty as well, on kind of like top on all of that as well? Because I know that's something that I'm kind of conscious of at our school, is that when we, and I'm saying it's quite rare that we have to deploy the HLTA to cover a class, but we're also then quite considerate of the fact that then she also has there will be other duties that she needs to do as well, which means actually she doesn't get much of a break, and her lunch is only about half an hour because she has to then cover half an hour. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, well, one of the key things was that one of the first things I did when I went into a classroom to cover would be I'd ask if there was a TA or if there was a partner teacher next door. I'd go to them and say, "Is it my break duty today?" Because that's one of the first. You get that wrong. You only need to get that wrong a couple of times before you realize that it's an area where you can't drop the ball. I think ideally someone else would cover that, because you need as much space mentally as you can find between lessons. Again, I think more than if you were the one to have planned those lessons. But yeah, generally I was asked to, cover do whatever duty, whatever role that teacher was asked to undertake that day, including in some circumstances covering for the clubs that they might be running after school or at lunchtime.
That's really interesting. And certainly I'm going to circle back to some of the points you raise as we go through this conversation, Chris. But I think, Lloyd, I'd be really interested to know, how do you support the development of HLTAs in your school?
Okay, so I mean, Chris has given a sort of more first-hand account there of the HLTA job in one setting. That's one example. Like, there are countless different experiences that HLTAs that I think is worth, and I know, Chris, you couch it with that as well, but there is so many different ways that people experience the HLTA role. I think we can make some generalizations. I do think that there are schools that ask HLTAs to cover whole terms and things like that, which I would agree, I think is too much. It's way too much to be asking of a high level teaching assistant. we need to look after these people. They are very, very important parts of the school system, I think, and they need to be looked after. And in order to look after them, there's different facets to that. But in terms of from a developmental point of view, from their own professional development, and autonomy, and their self-worth within the role as well, because that's important to them. I've actually today done 2 appraisals for HLTAs just today, and talking to them today, it's important, it matters to them, and so you've got to get this stuff right. And there's different ways I think you can do this depending on how many HLTAs you have in your school. Like I said, we have a lot. We have 5. So they're an integral part to how we organize our school. But there are things you can do to support their learning and to make it so that it's manageable for them as well, so that you're not asking them to do this outside of school hours, and you're not asking them to do this in their own time or anything. As it happens, we've got some pretty diligent, hardworking HLTAs who do that, because they're very committed, and they're very, very sort of invested in the development of the school as well as themselves. One thing we do is we have our same-day intervention model in school, where we have a 20-minute slot every day, where we use that to keep children up with learning, and we use it for both maths and English. Now, during that slot, the teacher's running the section with a small group of children. One of the senior leaders is in the hall delivering an assembly to the school. It then gives the HLTAs a little space, and we use that space to give them professional development. So they then I run this on a Monday on a weekly basis, and it's an opportunity for us to do the things that Chris just mentioned, for us to deliver messages that have just happened in the staff meetings, for us to just say, oh, right, this is what's happening. And okay, albeit a more condensed version perhaps, but they're abreast with what's going on in the school. So that's a really, really important time for them, and they feel part of it. That's another thing, is that they feel part of the team, because when you talk about the new spelling initiative that you're rolling out, they know what you're talking about, because you've done that with them in a more condensed version. So it's a really important time that for us. Another thing we're looking to consider next year is how we build them into our instructional coaching model. We actually want to do that as part of their offer, but again, all within the school day, all within that time, that slot, or nothing outside of their hours. So that they don't feel like they have to take anything home or do anything, but they still feel valued, and they still get in that development. We also film our CPD. So when we deliver, so like today for example, we did a spam session today. We open up Zoom and we share the screen and we press record. So it just to staff in a staff meeting, it makes no bones, because you're still delivering it, but it's recording, which is quite powerful, because then it gets saved centrally on our drive and shared out to the whole staff. So if HLTAs want to choose to watch that, and it might be on a day where they are not in with me doing some training, they can go and watch that. They can watch that for 15 minutes and 20 minutes if they should choose it. Or if they want to watch it at home, they can. If that's something they want to do, then the option's there for them to do it. It's about giving them choice. It's about giving them the opportunity to pick when they would like to do these things. It's saying, look, we value you. We value your professional development. So we're going to look at what mechanisms we can put in place to help to support that. So that's another thing that was sort of quite important. The appraisal process in itself also is key. Really, really important. And it's sort of, we've got to make sure that we give them the same value that we give teachers. So when we set their goals for appraisal, we set them in the same way we set our teacher goals. We go against the standards. We get them to reflect. We use sort of growing great HLTAs, if you will. We look and we pick a sort of a goal that's based on a model, zooming out. So all of these things together really feed in. And I think the last thing I'll say before I finish is just their career pathway as well. When we advertise HLTAs, we also advertise with routes into teaching. So if they should choose to want to go into a teaching role, it's an avenue for them to take as well. So all of these things creates that culture in your school that values the HLTA role. And I think, it's just really important. It's really, really important. We deliver the ECF with them. We work through the ECF in those training sessions, because it's all there, it's ready to go, it's boxed, and they love it. They love knowing about what the current practice is all about, and knowing when we're talking about cold calling, or we're talking about wait times and these sorts of things. This is all part of something they're experiencing, so they can talk to teachers and they can talk to other practitioners about it. So there's some things there that we do in terms of looking after their development.
I mean, from a practical point of view, I think most schools are either on Microsoft Office or Google. Microsoft Office has an app, which I think most schools get for free, called either Steam or Stream. And essentially, it's a place where you can house those CPD videos and you can control who has access to them. So if you want somewhere you can share them, then if you're a Microsoft Office school, you go there. Google Forms allow you to embed videos in them. And so I did some training with some early years practitioners at my last school, and I would have a paragraph response box, and I broke down the new early learning goals and sort of the changes to mathematics and into small manageable chunks, because a lot of the adults working in nursery and reception weren't necessarily on teacher contracts and couldn't be expected to complete sort of the same amount of hours of training. So I think just from a practical aspect, I definitely want to circle back to the instructional coaching, because that's where this episode came from. But I wondered, Neil, is there anything that you do differently to Lloyd when supporting your HLTAs?
Yeah, not too much. As I say, we only have we have many TAs, but only one HLTA, so we don't necessarily see a divide in their development. The way that we will run it is that whilst during same-day intervention, Monday to Thursday, where teachers are working with pupils, some HLTAs may take some other pupils out and do a few little bits with them, or they're in the assembly kind of supporting and managing some pupils who need that additional support. What we do slightly differently is that on Friday, which is our celebration assembly, which tends to be a little bit longer, that assembly can be about half an hour. Teachers go to that one, but our HLTA and our whole TA staff, they do not, and they get their training there. It's quite responsive depending on the needs of whatever that might be. So we might be thinking about Pastor's Perch, but in the context of the playground, for example. So taking that idea of, standing where you can see the most amount of people, and kind of goes back to kind of what Elliot Morgan, friend of the show, said about because we have one HLTA, they can kind of be that conduit and almost like take that lead role in terms of getting that buy-in from TAs that this is something that needs to happen. But other times, I know our reading lead right now, we've done our little walk-arounds, we've had a look at the interventions, we think they can tighten up a bit of the reading that they're doing with pupils. So, they've had for the last kind of 3 or 4 weeks they've had some professional development on how to kind of support in the delivery of the phonics scheme that we use. And it kind of then gives them the time as well to, make some resources, for that as well. So we ask our TAs to deliver interventions. That's absolutely fine to do. So the HLTA obviously gets that professional development as well. So she might be teaching that whole class some days because of the nature of her role. But obviously the TAs, they themselves, who'll be doing small little groups or perhaps one-to-one, they get that time for that professional development, and as well that resource creation that obviously needs to go into actually making those a reality.
In terms of supporting HLTAs, just one thing I remember in particular, I mean, I've made it sound like, the school I was at weren't supportive at all and it was a real challenge. And the second part's true. The first part isn't actually. The school were in many ways really supportive of me. And one of the things I remember in particular was an occasion where I was just having a conversation with a head teacher, and there was a change of head teacher while I was actually at school, and it was a new head teacher who just started. And I mentioned that I had, as part of my role, I'd covered for another TA in another classroom who was working one-to-one with a particular student. And I just happened to mention how much I liked the maths teaching that I'd seen. I said, I felt like I learned a lot from watching that. And the head teacher immediately came back at me and said, well, maybe we can get some more opportunities for you to watch that teacher teach maths. Do you think that'd be beneficial? And I thought it was. So that was something I got to do over the course of, the time that I was at that school. Whenever there was an opportunity that was there, I got to watch this teacher. I got to learn from them. It was a teacher who'd been teaching for like 25 or 30 years, and everything she did was second nature. And it was glorious to watch. But little things like that, just recognizing that, just like in some ways, an early careers teacher, or even a fairly experienced teacher, you've got lots to learn, but you've got this desire to learn, you've got this curiosity, and just assuming that HLTAs also have this kind of sense of curiosity is a really valuable thing to do. Having the chance to watch some really good teachers is great. The other thing I'd note about it, and again, I was a qualified teacher at this point, but I still found really valuable, was the chance to get in and co-plan, and just occasionally the chance to see what planning looked like. Obviously very different between Key Stage 1 and reception, where they seem to have a much longer term view, as well as a day by day kind of reactiveness. So yeah, planning meetings and getting the chance to see really good teachers was key to my development.
However challenging it might have been, you didn't decide that you didn't have any more energy for education. You came back to whole class teaching. So something positive must have happened on that journey, to encourage you to think, actually, I want to give this another go. In terms of your plans for instructional coaching, Lloyd, what I've seen in my career, it's a pretty involved model with a pretty big time commitment. And I'm trying to imagine, if I were you, what would I be doing? Would I have to shake everything up? I mean, I suppose this could go to the whole way across the group. If you were trying to utilize and get the benefits of instructional coaching with all members of staff, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The practical difficulties of instructional coaching and implementing instructional coaching are vast. Having implemented it this year, sort of a good way now into the implementation of IC in our school with our teaching staff, that's taken a big commitment mechanism-wise in terms of carving out after school sessions on a Wednesday, after the staff training sessions, to protect that time for feedback every other week. You would need to do the same thing with, like, for us, I'm just thinking out loud, it would have to be the same thing within those SDI slots, but it would have to be senior leaders doing it, which I'll be honest, I don't know at the minute that I have the capacity to do. So it would have to be a piece of work that I would need to go away and strategically work out. I'm not saying it can't be done. I think it just needs a lot of thought, because you're absolutely right in a sense that if you don't get those mechanisms in place to protect the routine of instructional coaching, it will die on its feet. And like that's coming from a place where we're implementing it, where we have protected it, and it's still really hard. Like, that's even with a protected space, it's still challenging. So I say instructional coaching for them. I don't think it's going to be soon that we would do that with our staff, because we've, in terms of our HLTAs, not in the rest of our staff, in terms of HLTAs, I think it's something that I would need to look at. Well, we are looking at it, but it's going to be next year, end of next year, potentially, realistically. We've got to be reasonable about when you plan implementation as well, because realistically, otherwise you rush into something and it falls down because of the reasons you've alluded to. I don't know what others think about.
Well, based on what you've said there, I think it's the thing I would note is that you presumably want to have a really solid model with what you're doing with teachers before you then kind of are confident enough to say we can then roll it out to further staff. I mean, what I might say now might not be something that I would advise necessarily, but off the top of my head, if I were an HLTA and someone said, you're going to be doing instructional coaching, but because of the logistical nature of it, it might be less frequent than it is with teachers, I think personally, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I think it's something that I would say, I recognize that there are different time constraints. Often what I need to do is be a bit more flexible in my timetable than a class teacher is. And so for that reason, firstly, it might mean that my instructional coaching doesn't have this set in stone regular time slot. It's just more of a commitment that I know what at any given moment, I know what I'm working on. I've been supported to to see that modeled and to have the chance to practice that. And when that next session exactly comes, well, I think most HLTAs would be ready to say, I appreciate there's going to be a slightly different, flexible way of doing that. But at heart, the idea of saying we're going to commit to your professional development in that way, at least on some level, is something that I, as an HLTA, I would have found attractive at the time, and I like to think that most HLTAs would as well.
Yeah, we don't run IC at all at school I work in, but we do kind of, where possible, once every kind of big term, provide TAs and our HLTA to go and observe each other, as you might have done traditionally, where we as a senior leadership team, we have an idea of the strengths and weaknesses of the TAs and the HLTA in the classrooms, so we can kind of direct certain people to go and see people do certain things particularly well, and they can kind of learn in that kind of way. It's certainly not as structured as IC, but it's still a kind of a nice way to kind of just support them and kind of make them see that they are, we want them to get better, and we can find a group of your peers that we can direct you to help you with that.
Yeah, I think that investment is coming across most of the responses. That investment in the adults who work in our schools, making them feel valued, because quite often when people feel valued, they go above and beyond. Whether the education system relies on that too much or not, well, I suppose we'll get to. But yeah, I can see that, and I think a lot of the principles of IC, even if we can't create the whole model, even like you're saying, Neil, being really deliberate in this person is particularly strong in this particular area is, a reasonably effective thing to ask someone to do, or reasonably, it'll have benefits. Is it fair to expect HLTAs to assimilate lots of similar knowledge to teachers without equal remuneration?
Can I dive in on that one? It's a boring answer, but it depends. I mean, it really depends. I think under some of the circumstances we've described, where someone's covering for very long periods of time, they're expected to plan for a period of time, they have the same kind of safeguarding responsibilities, et cetera, then it's obviously not fair for them not to be remunerated, at least to the level of an unqualified teacher. However, while I talk about the difficulties of being an HLTA, and while I talk about the challenges that I faced, with the caveat that, of course, this is just one person's experience, I was an HLTA at one school, I don't think that once I was out the school gates, there was that same stress as being a class teacher. It did not. In the end, I knew that someone else was responsible for this class, for their results, for their safety. And as long as I was kind of doing my bit when I was there in front of the kids, then it wasn't my class in the same way. So I think there are differences in terms of how it feels and that sense, and just the hours that you're working effectively. So under most circumstances, while I do think, and I'm sure we'd all agree on this, that HLTAs are often underpaid, I think it's to say that they should automatically receive the same remuneration as a classroom teacher because they're taking on some of that role is probably a little bit pie in the sky. It's a little bit out there. And at least to someone who has been an HLTA, I wouldn't have been expected to be paid the same as someone who has that kind of deep-seated responsibility for that class. Because in the end, as an HLTA, there is usually, for certain things, an extent to which you can pass the buck. If things get too hot to handle, you could just pass it on.
I was just wondering, thinking about what you were saying, Chris, about long-term, short-term. Obviously, you can argue for a while on the semantics of what classifies as long-term, what classifies as a short-term. But let's say long term anything over than like a half term. If you were to say, we have this situation, recruitment is so difficult, what we can do is put you on the non-qualified teacher scale. We know we're going to need you for at least a term. So for this term, we'll pay you the non-qualified teacher entry level. Do you think that would be a fair kind of stopgap?
Yeah, I can say we did that when I was on paternity leave. We remunerated the one of our HLTAs during my paternity leave. That exact thing, Neil, you just said there. So I do think, I mean, we were talking 2 weeks there, and we saw that as a long time. So so that's how we viewed that as too long. So like we classed that as that. But I know there's schools there that have no choice, and then they end up putting these HLTAs into positions for like a whole term. I also think asking them to do planning and things, that's a lot. And you'd expect potentially a teacher to pick up as hard as that is, and potentially SLT to support with planning, support teachers to deliver planning to HLTAs. That's what I think would probably be the best model for that, if it's a short term or in the interim. But yeah, I think that's a really, really sensible thing that you've said. Then, like I say, we've done it, but I think I agree with Chris. There is. This is a difficult question, but the short answer, really, like I say, no, in a sense that there's a different set of standards there for HLTAs, and realistically, again, I'm speaking from my perspective as Chris is speaking from his perspective, and we know there are schools all across the land that do it differently and look at HLTAs differently. When I go into a class at HLTA, I know they're not a teacher, so I wouldn't apply the exact same standards that I would to a teacher that I would to a HLTA, and I feel like our staff know that. And it's about the culture then in your school, and it's about how you develop that culture of trust and that culture of safety for them as well. That actually, for example, we have our leaders, our senior leaders are out on a Wednesday morning, like all of them, like our senior leadership team. So our HLTAs are for that morning are engaged. Well, when we walk around, we know that we take that into account. When we go into the classrooms and things. So that it isn't, it isn't the class teacher, like you say. But yeah, tricksy little question, Mr. Mackle. Tricksy little question.
Yeah, I think there are kind of two ways to kind of look at this question. And again, I think that comes down to Kieran or Chris's careful crafting of it. Certainly in terms of the knowledge of what being a teacher is like and all of that, the kind of like the disciplinary side of it, for want of a better term, no. But I think, and perhaps I am being too harsh here, in which case I'm happy for people to tell me so, but I think in terms of subject knowledge, particularly in maths and English, I really do think there should be that expectation there that anyone who is pupil facing, they probably could support that child at a year 6 level. So we're kind of fortunate. Again, no purposeful plug here, but all of our TAs, HLTAs have access to complete maths CPD. They're not forced to use it by any stretch of the imagination, but should they want to go and have a look at the structures of arithmetic, Kieran has a very nice video that kind of talks them through that. Likewise, we might use some of those that CPD, that professional development time for their own subject knowledge of, this is what a subordinate clause is and a subordinate conjunction, and they can kind of go at the beginning of a sentence, at the end of a sentence, or you can sometimes throw them in between, sandwich them in between a main clause. So I do think subject knowledge wise, particularly for your core, I think it is fair to kind of expect that adults who work with children do have they are at a certain standard where they could teach those children the concepts that they would be taught in school at primary level.
Just like a final thing that I like to think maybe ties up this question a little bit and kind of links what I said earlier to what Lloyd said and to an extent what Neil said. If we look at the sort of standards of what defines an HLTA, at least going back to the 2003 agreement that Lloyd was talking about earlier, alongside this, short term for whole classes, the idea of an HLTA is that they are working in effect under the supervision and guidance of a qualified teacher. So at any point, even if it isn't like immediately there and then, on some level, it isn't kind of that person's class. And I think as soon as it becomes like, this is your class now, even if it's for a week or if it's for a month, as soon as it's like, this is your class now, and when it comes to your guidance and supervision, it's the same as that qualified teacher next door. I think when that's the case, I think really people do need to be remunerated in line with, an unqualified teacher rather than necessarily just as an HLTA. So it's worth going back to these kind of national definitions of what the roles entail.
So with all that in mind, how can we support HLTAs in their day-to-day work? What do you reckon, Neil?
Like we would support, I think, just any, human being. Check in with them. Make sure when you do the rounds, you say good morning to them as you do your, 5-minute walk around before the school day starts. Take an interest in them, have those conversations with them in the staff room. Try not to, I think, as a kind of a senior leader, try not to kind of and it's easy to happen, try to avoid that kind of culture of all the TAs kind of sit in one corner of the staff room and all the teachers sit in the other corner of the staff room, and they very rarely ever shall they mix unless they have to talk about work and stuff like that. So I think it's really kind of just making sure that you are kind of seen as one whole team, not I've got my main part of the team. I've got Team A here with my teachers and Team B, my TAs, HLTAs, kind of making sure it's all kind of one team. Again, if you see that they're stressed, ask them why, chip in. If they need 20 minutes and you can cover a break duty so that they can, go to the loo. Because that's something I've kind of noticed is that, we think teachers like timetables are so strict, like going to the loo and stuff. Like teaching assistant HLTAs, their gaps are so much smaller than a teacher's are, certainly in my experience anyway. So it's just kind of, being human and just, if they need 5-10 minutes to, make a coffee or to, pop to the loo when it's, they're on their break duty, whatever it is, because they, really can't hold it in, just, no questions asked, just do it. Because, it's those little kind of things that are going to mean on the rare occasion where, and we have had this happen where after school club, someone's gone off sick quite last minute, and you do need that last minute cover. Otherwise, you have to call parents and say, we can't do this. They are far more likely to then go, yeah, okay, like no problem. Like if it's for a day or two, like that's fine. I think you reap what you sow, don't you? Just from treating them like humans.
There's a couple of things I would probably consider when thinking about day-to-day support for a HLTA. Firstly, SEND support. Make sure they're supported with the SEND in the room, that they're aware of the provision and the reasonable adjustments that are made for children in the room. It's really that can literally ruin their day if they don't know, and then they end up getting into something with a child that they didn't understand the provision of, and then that can cause a whole manner of problems for parents and all sorts, kicking back on that. That was my first point. Communication is vital for them. So if they are covering, they're covering on a regular slot, make sure it's in advance. We're very, very strict with our teachers in terms of planning and things being sent at least a day in advance. And on that, making sure that the type of cover is reasonable. So if you have got a really difficult lesson, think about where in the sequence in your timetabling it can be. Can it be moved? Can something be shifted so that they're not having to deliver something very complex and it ends up then being really difficult for them? So I think that's really, really important. I think you need to centralize your comms. So make sure that, and this is something I've talked to our HLTAs about, is what's the best way to contact you? If I need to cover, what do you want? Do you want a WhatsApp message, an email? When would you like it? Would you like it the night before? Would you like it on the day, early in the morning? Talk to them about it. And that's what we did, and they wanted to know early in the morning and the day. So there wasn't a surprise when they were getting in, and they weren't getting blindsided by a cover if they had to do it late. That's what's really, really important. I think about really carefully about balance as well. So if you have got more than one HLTA, think about the balance. They talk to each other. So like if you are going to give one loads of cover and the other one hardly any cover, that's going to annoy someone. So equity and balance in making sure that things are fair. It's like stuff like that. It goes a long way. Like that you communicate that to staff and that they understand the remit of things. We also make sure that they don't have a cover duty on the day that they're covering at lunch. Like I said, we talked about earlier. We give them an hour wherever possible. Like it's a dire straits, of course, but wherever possible, we try and give them an hour for lunch because we say, well, if they have to do a day cover because someone's sick or something, then that's the case. So. And there's probably 100 more things. I'm sure Chris will add a few more bits as well. But they are some really key things that you can do, I think, to sort of protect those members of staff because they really, like I say, they're really important. They're gold dust. They are firmly part of the team, like Neil said. So yeah.
I think the heart of everything I'm about to say, you nailed right at the start there, Lloyd, with the idea of clear communications, because so much of it comes down to knowing what you're supposed to be doing. I think the point about SEND is very well made as well. A few of the bits and pieces related to that. I always appreciated when I was picking up someone else's planning, I recognized that this was clearly like a simplified version of that lesson. That is very, very useful because if you're picking up someone, this is like, oh, this was the lesson I was going to teach, and they've made no attempt to recognize that you don't know these kids, that you are going to teach it slower, your formative assessment isn't going to be quite so strong, except just your knowledge of where they've come from in the learning journey isn't going to be quite so strong. If they haven't made account of that, then it's going to be a lot more difficult to teach. So that's really useful. Where possible, getting HLTAs involved a little bit in planning if this is a regular thing. So it's I remember I worked for a while. I covered 2 days a week in year 2 and 2 days a week in reception, 1 day a week in year 2. I was often present, if not entirely involved. I was certainly present for bits and pieces of the planning, so I got a sense of what was going on. That was really helpful. It sounds like an odd thing to say, but it does tie in something you said much earlier in the episode, Lloyd. The idea of slightly lowered expectations of what a lesson's going to look like. If a member of SLT walks in and they see me slightly struggling with trying to explain something or trying to get a bit of formative assessment to work with a little bit of behavior, I want them to know in the back of their mind that this isn't my class. I haven't got those exactly the same routines. I don't know where the scissors and the glue sticks are. Everything is that little bit less fluent. Everything is that little bit more stressful. So I want them in the back of their mind to be bearing that in mind, that it would look different if this were my class, if I knew where everything is, but it isn't. I think teachers following up on behavior stuff is a really big deal as well. So if I've covered a class and a kid has given another kid a hard time, and there's been something that I've had to have a word with that child about, and I've mentioned it to the teacher, I can tell when the next time I'm in that class, if that teacher has followed that up. I can tell whether that teacher has presented us as a united teaching front, or whether they've just brushed it under the carpet because it's a little bit more, it's just easier to pretend it didn't happen. Last couple of things, because obviously a lot of what we've talked about today has been related to covering lessons. Obviously, a big part of an HLTA's role, a lot of the time, is delivering interventions, planning and delivering, and the assessment involved with that. I think where possible, seeing that intervention modelled by whoever's idea it was, whoever's read around this, whoever really knows it well, is a really valuable thing. Even if it's just once, can make a big difference. And as part of that, if I'm delivering an intervention as an HLTA on behalf of, say, a class teacher, if I understand the rationale behind it and what are the active ingredients, as it were, of that intervention, it makes it so much easier to get it right. Because otherwise you're just following a script, or you're following a set of instructions, and you don't know which bits you can be a bit looser on and which bits you need to be tight on. So that's a big deal when you're dealing with interventions as well. But yeah, those would be kind of quite a lot of practical things that really supported me as an HLTA.
Just want to come back on one thing that Chris said at the very beginning, where he mentioned you'd have a bit of dumbed down planning. Sometimes it might be totally appropriate for you to plan a completely different lesson that's out of the sequence. If it's time for you, if that the lesson was going to be the children were going to do, a big write, as it were, and it's time for that extended piece of writing, and it's heads down, and for whatever reason you are ill or something happens, you just give them something else to do because it's not fair for them to kind of juggle that kind of performance there that needs to go in to make sure that those lessons are successful for the kids. So I honestly think, yes, where possible, kind of if it's appropriate, think about how you might deliver the same lesson in a slightly different way, but also in some cases scrap it and do something completely different that's going to be far more manageable for the teaching us the HLTA to do, especially if they're not the HLTA that's been in that class as the sequence of learning has been building up, so they don't really see what that end of sequence bit of writing is meant to look like. And also for the fairness on the children as well, they've been working hard on it. It's only right that they have someone there who really understands how to get the most out of them for that particular outcome.
I think that's going to be really useful for both teachers and for school leaders. Practical advice on how we can support anyone who is supporting us in sort of what our stated aims as a school might be. So I think that's going to be really useful. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Chris.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.
Now don't press stop recording yet.